The 2026 Eurovision Song Contest is now complete, and it's come with a distinct sense of déjà vu. That's because we've been saved from an Israeli win once again by the fact that one and only one country has managed to surpass them on the scoreboard. We had the all or nothing scenario of the final split screen. Again. We had the imminent feeling that the contest could be about to fall apart entirely. Again. And the contest took a massive amount of reputational damage. Again. Today I'm going to try and unpack what we've seen over the last couple of weeks and where the contest goes next. What's curious to me is that this does feel a little bit different to 25 and 24. In 2024, I felt really angry at this point. In 2025, myself and I think a lot of other people were shell-shocked by what happened because we didn't expect Israel to get so close. In 2026, I think exhaustion is probably the word. And the overwhelming sense that the contest really cannot keep doing this if it wants to survive even to 2030, let alone another 70 years. We're going to devote plenty of time to talking about that today. That said, there are other headlines to cover too, which are significant both for this year and for the future of the contest. We had a first-time winner, one that almost nobody saw coming until the week of the show, and we had a production that was... well, it was there. We're going to talk about those aspects as well, of course, but ultimately the big question is where the contest goes from here. What options are available to it and what factors are going to come into play whatever happens over the next 12 months. I suspect that we are going to be in a very different environment by the time it comes to May 2027 in a range of ways, some predictable and some not. Quickly, before we go any further, if you do want to subscribe, that would be much appreciated. We've just hit 60,000 subscribers on the channel, and it would be great to get even further past that milestone now. Let's start with the winner. Dara from Bulgaria with the song Bangaranga has won the Eurovision Song Contest by the widest winning margin in the contest's history. I would have expected literally no part of that sentence to come out of my mouth 12 months ago. This was a country that was out of the contest and didn't look likely to return. They had participated once in the last 4 editions, and that was the Intelligent Music Project, whose music was so intelligent that it gained a whole 29 points in the semi-finals and finished second to last. Bulgaria had been a powerhouse from 2016 to 2021, but with the broadcaster in dire financial straits, they had eventually fallen out of the contest, as many countries in the Balkans have done. Then, this year, they returned, and the indications we have are that the organisers of Eurovision, which is the European Broadcasting Union, or EBU for short, made some kinds of accommodations to make this possible. I'm basing this on what fellow returnees Romania said in the announcement that they made about returning to the contest. They cited adaptations to account for the challenges the broadcaster is facing. The translation for this is, we're broke, so the EBU let us in for cheap. Whether such a deal would have been possible had 5 countries not withdrawn from the contest in protest against Israel's participation is another matter, but we'll discuss that at length later in the video. Even once we got through Bulgaria's bizarrely formatted national selection, where they selected an artist one month and a song the next, and once we ended up with Dara, who's an indisputably extremely talented performer, the sense was generally that Bangaranga would be a competent mid-table entry. For me personally, I didn't get the song. I felt it was a little too repetitive, and I had it qualifying in the lower part of the semi-final. That, obviously, was not how things turned out. I, along with pretty much every other pundit, the odds, and basically everybody else, had no idea what was coming. What we ended up getting on stage was a world-class performance that redefines what female-led pop music looks like in a Eurovision context. Dara's charisma, combined with one of the best choreographies we've seen in this show for a very long time, transformed the prospects for this entry. We've seen these moments come along before. Eleni Ferreira in 2018 and Chanel in 2022 spring to mind, but neither of them actually got over the line and won the thing. Certainly not by a margin of 173 points. In the process, we have learned a lot. First and foremost, this shows that it's still possible to win Eurovision in the week of the contest. Bulgaria kept their hand so close to their chest, to the point of counterintuitively showing the last 30 seconds of the performance in their publicly released rehearsal clip. This avoided showing the music video-esque way in which most of the performance was shot, and it avoided revealing their prop. The betting odds on the morning of the first rehearsal for Dara's semi-final had Bulgaria as 16th favourite to win the contest. Lots of other delegations instead took this and other opportunities to try and change the momentum of the conversation in their favour. But by doing the opposite, the Bulgarians actually maximised the impact when we all saw it for ourselves in that semi-final. From there, they shot up the odds and they had all the hype they needed. And by the time the final rolled around, Dara was among the favourites. We already know what happened next. The contest really needed something to be optimistic about, and the first commercially viable winner since 2023 is perhaps a way of ensuring that. While I love Nemo and JJ and their winning songs, we needed something streamable, and we needed at some point for a modern pop song to win, to show it was still possible and encourage a higher level of engagement from that part of the industry. One of the few victories that the contest actually scored this year was that we got that. In terms of the wider picture in a competitive sense, with retrospect, a shock winner was always a distinct possibility. We did have clear betting odds favourites for sure, but the overwhelming consensus among Eurovision fans and among media was that there wasn't going to be a landslide and no one was miles out ahead. I have a reputation for being extremely positive about Finland, for example, and while I absolutely think my praise for their entries and their national finals has been justified and I will stand by it, I've been saying for weeks now that Liekenheten, while I felt it was a fair favourite, wasn't passing the smell test for the kinds of numbers we were seeing in the fan polls and so on. Those indicators would have suggested to you that at least among the fandom it was the most popular song in Eurovision in about half a decade. That was obviously not the case, and it didn't feel like that either. In any case, I will take the L on that and all the other things that I got wrong. There's going to be a video in 2 weeks where we go through basically every mistake I made, and there's going to be a lot this time. I cursed basically everybody. One thing I will defend though is that while I didn't list Bulgaria as a possible winner in my Here's Who Will Win Eurovision video, I did manage to curse just about everybody else. Paradoxically, I predicted how every country in that video would fall short and fail. I said that France, Australia and Denmark would have jury strength, but the public would be a problem. They finished second, third and fourth in the jury, and all did significantly better on that side than they did with the public. I said that Greece would have the opposite problem, with strength from the public, but not as much from the jury, and lo and behold, double the score from the public that they got from the jury. It's ironic for a video that tries to predict a winner, but I ended up being something of a kiss of death for everybody. This has become an alarming pattern extending over multiple years now, so God help whoever I predict to win the contest next year. In any case, this result means we're heading to Bulgaria for the first time. And if the crowds that greeted Dara when she got home are anything to go by, they seem to have pretty enthusiastically embraced it. It also has implications for the contest more widely. This is the first time we've been in Eastern Europe since 2017 and the first time in the Balkans since 2008. Additionally, this Eurovision will be much cheaper for delegations than Austria or Switzerland or the Nordics have been. North Macedonia has already agreed to return to the contest, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if the fact that Bulgaria is logistically and financially so much easier for them is a big part of this decision. The Bulgarian broadcaster BNT is not exactly swimming in cash themselves, but the government has already indicated that they will financially support this to ensure it's possible. This is pretty standard because most governments now recognise that you'll make your money back through tourism income and so on. What I will say is though, BNT said in one of their first statements after the contest that they wanted to emulate the example set by Austria's broadcaster ORF. This next section will serve as a dire warning to do basically literally anything else. Amid a backdrop of scandal and disrepute, what Eurovision really needed this year was a production that demonstrated its ongoing importance. And that meant the Austrian broadcaster had to deliver. Unfortunately, in short, they abjectly failed on almost every single indicator. Instead, we got a Eurovision production that felt like an empty vessel. Sure, the contest was there, but it felt totally unloved by the broadcaster that was hosting it on every single level. Unfortunately, I have to remind you of our hosts, Michael Ostrovsky and Victoria Swarovski. As a side note, the Green Room host, Emily Busvine, was actually very good and seems lovely, so she is entirely exempted from the criticism in this section. Congratulations, Emily, you're the only one who did your job. Anyway, apparently Michael Ostrovsky is one of Austria's best comedians, and my friends have told me that he's genuinely very funny in German. This absolutely did not come across in English, and I hope he did not have anything to do with the horrifically bad script, which we'll come onto in a moment. He delivered his lines as if he had never seen them before they appeared on the screen. As it happens, that might have actually been the case in some instances, because commentators this year, before the first semi-final, received a 32-page document of changes to the script 2 minutes before it went live to air. Victoria Swarovski, meanwhile, delivered one of the most emotionless and wooden performances I've ever seen from a host. The moment that will stick out for me is actually from a rehearsal, where the stage wasn't ready in time, so they cut to the hosts in the green room to, say some facts about the country that was coming up and kill time. When a radio message came into Victoria's ear while she was speaking, she snapped back on the mic for all the press in the room to hear, "Don't interrupt me when I'm presenting." You can get away with this if you're actually good at your job, but this only served to further demonstrate she clearly wasn't meant for this. There has been lots of criticism of her role, but given her $150 million net worth and her $4 billion family fortune, I don't suspect she will be particularly bothered. Nor do I feel the need to extend her that much grace. All we can do is marvel at just how far you can get in the world simply by virtue of being from a mega rich family. A truly disastrous pair of hosts are aren't complete without equally disastrous, tasteless, and generally abysmal interval acts, which ranged from the horrific to the offensive. After we saw the Australia versus Austria cringe fest during the first semi-final, complete with a twerking kangaroo that had the ability to blink for some reason, and a 10-second joke stretched out over several minutes, we thought that would probably be the low point. Unfortunately, it wasn't. There were also Professor Eurovision segments, where Victoria gave lectures in a mock-up university theatre about different aspects of the contest, while inexplicably being surrounded by AI-generated robots. One of these was meant to celebrate the LGBT+ community's place at the contest, but they managed to bungle it so badly that the piece rambled on about how the majority of fans of production were actually straight, before it closed with the line, "Let's replace all the letters in LGBTQIA+ with just one, H for human." Yeah. Really. These two were the pick of the bunch in terms of bad intervals, but I honestly could have picked almost any one of them. During the semi-finals, we literally had the hosts lip-syncing "I'm So Excited" on stage. The postcards were tacky and green-screened, just like in Turin in 2022, so thank God at the very least that the artists and the stage and the lighting designers managed to do their jobs fairly well. It's so sad to see that the level of imagination and care that was put into making this show was essentially zero. What ORF produced would have maybe been an acceptable standard for Eurovision in the early 2010s. It is absolutely not acceptable now. This was the 70th anniversary of the contest, and you would have thought that there would have been a little more of that feeling in spite of the cloud that has been hanging over the event in the last few years. Instead, we were presented with an empty vessel, a contest with no soul whatsoever, and one where it felt like there was no real joy or love for the event coming from the broadcaster that was organising it. This is all the more baffling considering that Austria spent 20 million euros on this. When we look back to other underwhelming Eurovisions, or Eurovisions where the community generally feels that they were weaker in terms of production, we do still see bright spots. Turin might have been shitty in almost every way, and the stage literally broke, but at least between the artists, the hosts, and the near universal solidarity with Ukraine, something beautiful was still shining there. Kiev 2017 had possibly the most troubled preparation period of any Eurovision in the last decade, but it came together and the show again felt like something that was genuine, that was authentic, and that showed us a piece of Ukraine. Watching that, it felt to me like they wanted to share that with us, and they wanted to share the joy of the contest. This had none of those redeeming features whatsoever. This is a big call, but I think this might have been the worst produced edition of Eurovision in the modern post-2012 era. That's when we moved out of massive cavernous stadiums and back into smaller arenas again. What didn't help matters, of course, was the fact that all of this was amplified by the still ever-present elephant in the room. Israel remained in the contest in 2026, despite the withdrawals of the Netherlands, Spain, Iceland, Ireland, and Slovenia from the contest in protest. I started this video by saying there was a sense of deja vu. That certainly applied to the result, where once again Israel found its way onto the split screen, and we stared down the abyss for another very unpleasant few minutes. What was different was that this year everybody felt like we could see it coming. In Basel in 2025, perhaps owing to the trauma of basically every element of the contest's circumstances in 2024, there was a real complacency and an expectation, which I shared, that Israel's televote would substantially fall. That in turn would have prevented us from ending up in the same situation as 2024, where it felt there was a real looming possibility that they might win the whole thing, and in turn inexplicably scored 323 points from the public. Instead of that number substantially falling in 2025, it stayed high. And with massive jury and televote disagreements, we were all of a sudden blindsided by the presence of Israel on the split screen and the very real possibility that they could win and destroy the contest in the process. The reaction afterwards was one of extreme shock, and it jolted a number of broadcasters into action. This year, while the outcome was the same, nobody was under any illusions. Israel's track record of manipulating the voting process is now well enough documented and understood that everybody knew in advance that their score would be vastly inflated beyond what would have been scored had this song been competing on the same terms as every other country. That meant when their score did come, 220 points from the public, good enough for only third place on that side, there was relief and confusion. Yes, they were still on the split screen, and yes, it was still unreasonably high, but it was a significant drop from last year's 297, even when accounting for the fact that fewer countries were participating. I have a few different different thoughts about this, and the first is that we should be under no illusions here. Just because Israel's campaign was executed less successfully than last year does not mean the problem has been solved. We have documentary evidence in multiple countries of Israeli-aligned advocacy organizations mobilizing their support bases to vote the maximum allowable number of times, specifically citing the importance of demonstrating political support for Israel as the reason why they should do this. Lots of different countries have grassroots advocacy organizations all over the world which lobby in the interests of those countries. Only Israel uses them in this way to manipulate the contest. We also know that an attempt was made to run the same now infamous advertising campaigns that were run last year and the year before too. In previous years, these were funded by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This year, allegedly they weren't, despite being filmed in the same studio and using the same language. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. What was different this time around was that the EBU actually clamped down and put a stop to it. In the process, they've established a precedent that saying in your adverts you can vote up to 10 times or similar language is considered disproportionate and won't be allowed in future. There are some signs in the results that do make me raise my eyebrows. Israel got 12 points from the rest of the world voting at every single opportunity, semi-final and final in 2023, 2024 and 2025. Then this time they came second with the rest of the world in the semi-final and fifth in the final. After 12 points came from the Australian public in both 2024 and 2025, after 12s came from the Australian public in both of the last 2 years, this year all of a sudden Israel plummeted down to 20th. Under normal circumstances, vast swings like this aren't necessarily indicative, given that it's different songs each year. But in this case, where we know for a fact, and have evidence, some of which I've just shown you, that the Israeli televote is, in the best case, based entirely or almost entirely on explicit political mobilization, these kinds of things are of note. We obviously don't know how the voting system works or what happens behind the scenes, but it does make you wonder whether certain patterns of illegitimate behavior that in the past were able to slip through are now being identified reliably enough by the contest's integrity systems to be dealt with and to screen out votes in some way. Eurovision's voting systems are, and have been for some years, designed to filter out blunt instruments, things like SIM card farms in single locations. And it wouldn't surprise me if each year the system is updated to deal with new forms of manipulation as well. For me, there are essentially two takeaways here. Firstly, if this is the case, then essentially the public vote in the contest is now an arms race between Eurovision's voting security systems and the combined energies of the small but extremely committed grassroots support base that Israel has across Europe, particularly in the West. This is not sustainable by any means. One year the system might be able to deal with it, but the next year something else will inevitably happen to get around it again. To an extent, televoting has always been like this in isolated cases, but it has never faced a campaign on the scale of the one waged by these pro-Israel groups over the last 3 editions. The second thought is, if these campaigns were detected and the system did filter votes based on that, then surely this is a smoking gun of what many of us have been calling out for years now. Israel's manipulation of the contest results is real. It's widespread and it's a critical danger to its integrity in the coming years. If there was ever a time to take action, it's now. This is especially true given the context surrounding the contest now. The entire show this year was dominated by this issue and it permeated through every room, every delegation and every performance. It drains so much joy out of this experience, not just because of the sword of Damocles that hangs over our heads in the form of a potential Israeli victory, but also on a much more basic human level. No country should be allowed to use a forum like Eurovision to manufacture consent for what has been recognized as a genocide, both by international and domestic Israeli human rights organizations. Eurovision is something beautiful and something irreplaceable. It's an institution that cannot simply regenerate if it is destroyed, for a whole variety of reasons, and it's being recklessly endangered by maintaining an Israeli participation. This brings me around to the final point, and ultimately the most important part of this video. Where does the contest go from here? What levers are even realistically available to the organizers? I have some thoughts, though given how unpredictably the last year went, we can rule nothing in or out at this stage. I feel very strongly that Israel still has no place in this competition. A lot of the routes for that becoming a reality are now closed off. You can't really do it on ethical or political grounds. While I do believe there was briefly enough support for this around September 2025, broadcasters rapidly lost their bravery as soon as a ceasefire came into effect, regardless of how effective or how faithfully observed that ceasefire has been. In addition, there are Israeli elections coming up this year in October. Current polling indicates that Netanyahu might lose. For that reason, among European countries, there may be more of an appetite to buy time in hope that the government changes in Israel and that more things become possible, rather than taking action on things like this this now? It's obviously unrelated, but I do partly wonder as well whether the EU is holding back on certain levels of sanctions on Israel for the same reason. The other roadblock to the ethical/political path to removing them is the massive power that Germany holds within the EBU. They are the biggest economy and they have the biggest population, so it follows that they are the biggest financial contributor to the Eurovision Song Contest. While others such as Austria are equally strong in their implacable opposition to Israel being removed, the EBU, as we've seen, would not lose sleep over smaller contributors leaving. Germany, though, holds this position, and therefore removal in this way is simply not possible. They cannot do it without German financial backing. Even in the context of Eurovision's Big Five, my understanding is that the contributions made by the UK and Germany are dramatically higher of that of Spain, for example. Because of the funding model of Eurovision and of the EBU, this kind of economic pressure is easily one of the single biggest drivers of the decision-making process in the last few years. That means that the only realistic sanction that is even politically possible for the EBU to apply would be something related to rules being demonstrably broken. That is, rules of the contest. From what I understand, these apply year to year and warnings don't accumulate. So once one contest ends, the slate is effectively wiped clean. What this means is, even though Israel has accumulated a number of warnings for different things over the last few years, you wouldn't be able to take those warnings in totality and say, you've now done X number of things, so we're going to suspend you. It's a really stupid system, but if that's the framework, that's the framework. And we have no choice but to work within it for the purposes of this, for the time being. Practically speaking, this means the only circumstance I can see where realistically Israel is not at the contest in 2027 is if the manipulation of the voting has been flagged and can be demonstrated to the membership in a way that is clear and obvious. That is a bar that is considerably higher than simply being able to perceive that manipulation happening. There needs to be a demonstration of the scale and intent, and without knowing the details of what did or didn't get flagged by the voting security systems, we can't really speculate on whether building such a case is possible or not. Given the high bar of evidence I've just laid out, I think it is more likely than not that Israel will participate in Eurovision in 2027. Unless we get the random curveball of the Israeli broadcaster being privatized, as has been threatened by Netanyahu several times over the last few years, or alternatively, we have a very dramatic geopolitical shift in Europe. Again, this is not impossible, but it seems pretty unlikely given the amount of movement that would be required. Proceeding on that basis, here and elsewhere means we need to continue to evaluate what role our coverage plays as media specializing in the Eurovision Song Contest and where we fit into this picture. I've naturally dedicated a lot of time to thinking about this over the last few months as well. The conversation around Israel and Eurovision has totally shifted in the last few years, and we're now in a situation where I would argue the majority of people now see and understand what we have seen and understood all along. The Israeli public vote score is not legitimate and hasn't been for a few years. In addition to that, it's clearly the result of foul play somewhere on some level. This has come as a result of the continuing dramatic souring of public opinion on Israel. They are now less popular among Europeans than North Korea, and as a result of the now widespread media coverage on this manipulation. This is a story that has now made its way into the pages of the New York Times. This is a massive PR problem for Israel because it really undermines the purpose of their participation and of the score inflation in the first place. The moment the majority of the audience views your participation and your score as illegitimate, you lose any ability to use that score as evidence of a silent majority in your favor or as an endorsement of your state's actions. Not only that, the well has been poisoned for good, and at least for the foreseeable future, nobody will view Israel's public score as anything close to legitimate, whether they come first, third, or 17th in that part of the results. I feel very strongly then that media coverage of the contest plays two important roles currently. The first is to be clear-eyed about what we're seeing, as I have done in this video and on many occasions in the past, and to help both inform the core Eurovision fan audience and the wider audience that coalesces around May on how these things apply in the context of the contest specifically. It's not just about equipping people with the knowledge and arguments they need to understand this manipulation themselves. It's about them being able to explain these things in simple terms to other people as well. The continuing coverage that I and others do is part of that process and helps enable it. The second thing is something I've spent a lot of this season trying to do, keeping the other bits of Eurovision, the things it should really be about, out, alive and kicking, even while this issue tries to destroy them. That means ensuring that other artists do get their moments in the sun, that important stories are still told, and that we remind ourselves why this thing is so important to us and to so many others. That's why I went to Moldova and tried to tell the story of their struggle to join the European wider community of nations, and of how they're building a Moldovan identity. You can see a lot of that through the prism of the contest. That's also why I told Felicia's personal story of how Melody Festival and Eurovision are at the core of how she escaped a coercive and controlling producer and was finally able to release music in her own name that she got credit and royalties for. This is why I tried to shine a light on artists' personal and professional motivations in Estonia and how Eurovision fits into different commercial music markets across Europe in different ways. All of this is far too important to be imperiled by continued Israeli participation at the contest. But those stories will wither away from the picture in any case if they're not told. I very strongly feel it is important for us to do so and to celebrate them, including celebrating with the large proportion of my audience that is still watching here but has chosen to boycott the contest at large. I was really struck by just how many messages I received from people in that position this year. And if you're one of those people, I really appreciate you still being here, and I'm glad we can create a space where you feel comfortable to engage with this thing on some level that you've loved for so long. To put it simply, if I did not believe that my coverage and my presence in this space was having a net positive effect on the contest, I wouldn't be doing it. I think what we are doing here is important, and what we are doing here is going to continue. I feel absolute certainty and conviction about this now more than I ever have. That does not mean we have to shy away from the big conversations. I've never done that before, and I won't now. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't be very honest about the competition and what would happen to it if nothing changes. My honesty on this has cost me accreditation before, and if it does in the future, then so be it. The clear and overall message is, if Israel remains in the competition, Eurovision will limp on for now. But with every year that passes, a death by 1,000 cuts scenario will continue to loom. New countries might join and some boycotters might return. There are murmurs of both already, as we've mentioned. But the core threats to the contest are not going to change. All of the figures released so far suggest that viewership has fallen significantly in most countries this year, with a fall of more than 15% in the United Kingdom, which is the contest's biggest market. While there are more reasons for this beyond just reputational issues, they at least play a part in the contest this year being one of the least streamed in a really long time. The audience has started to vote with their feet because the vast majority feel the same way that I do. The contest can never truly be a celebration if it still allows itself to be instrumentalized by bad faith political campaigns designed to manufacture consent for the unspeakable. At this point, everybody knows what would fix it. Eurovision can only stay on life support in this way for so long. Nothing and nobody can save the long-term reputation of the contest without a change in path. And I genuinely believe it is not too late to do this, especially amid a backdrop of a hugely popular winner and a country hosting that has nowhere near the level of pro-Israel geopolitical sentiment that Austria did. The only way that change happens, as I said, is if there is incontrovertible evidence that demonstrates the voting manipulation we can all clearly see. Or alternatively, if the political situation changes dramatically and does so before the EBU's General Assembly in December. I hope we see that change. For today, we're going to wrap up. We will go a bit more into depth on the results themselves next year when we do our yearly Eurovision winners and losers video, and I'll also be engaging in another self-roast in 2 weeks' time. That'll be when we go through the many things that I got wrong in the contest this year. Please do subscribe and make sure you watch those if you haven't already. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I really appreciate everyone who has chosen to spend a little bit of their Eurovision season and Eurovision week with us here on this channel. I'll still be around for the off-season, and Eurovision Asia is still to come soon. Take care, and I'll see you again next week.